Hello to everyone watching this partnership meeting back on our YouTube channel. I'm Bianca Pizzetti. I am the Age Friendly Project Officer at Bristol Aging Better, and I'm just re-recording this first presentation because there were some issues with the recording from the meeting itself, and also some issues with the slides I shared. Some of them didn't show up at the right time. So for anyone who's re-watching this, who was at the meeting or who wasn't able to make all of the meeting, you'll be able to see my slides as they were meant to be shown. And for anyone just watching on YouTube, you get to skip past the housekeeping bits for people on Zoom. One small bit of housekeeping if you are watching back, if you do have any questions for us or for the other speaker who joined us at this meeting, do pop a comment below and we'll see that and we can get back to you and pass on the question to Pippa if you've got one for her. Okay, so without further ado, I'll just jump straight into re-recording my presentation. Okay, so first of all, what is Age Friendly Bristol about? What does it do, and how have we, as a programme focusing on social connection, ended up taking the lead on something with such a large scope? Well, Age Friendly City work isn't new to Bristol. Joining the World Health Organization's global network of age-friendly cities was identified as one of the primary aims of our programme from the outset, included in the city's bid to the Lottery's Fulfilling Lives Aging Better Fund in 2014, following discussions by the council, charities and community organisations in preceding years, with Bristol achieving membership of the network in 2018. In order to join the network, we needed to complete a baseline assessment, which brought together national and local datasets and takeaways from meaningful conversations with our older citizens. A charter created with older people to set out 9 clear visions for a Bristol where age is no barrier to enjoying and fully participating in city life. And from there, create a strategy to address areas for improvement and to make the most of the assets we already have in our city's design, infrastructure, voluntary sector, culture, and most importantly, what people are already building in their communities. So all of what I've just outlined is done through the World Health Organization's framework for age-friendly cities, which groups the patterns identified in urban areas that are best meeting the needs of ageing populations under 8 domains. You can see here a diagram created by the WHO, which further groups them under 3 headings and which uses slightly different titles for the domains in some cases. And there are more person-centred ways to express these concepts too, such as we used in our podcast project, Here We Go, where transport was renamed Navigating the City and Feeling Well for community support and health services, and so on. So as you can see, age friendliness has many facets and encompasses a huge range of concepts and aspects. But essentially, it's everything that happens that changes in our inner world and the world around us as we age. And it's how organisations working in a place can be aware of and responsive to those changes, especially in light of demographic ageing and societal inequalities exacerbated by the pandemic. We're now at the implementation stage of Bristol's age-friendly journey. The journey doesn't end with the WHO recognising us as an age-friendly city. It simply means we have a good foundation of knowledge and good connections to be able to take things forward if we keep up the momentum. And that's why we're holding these partnership meetings between now and March 2022 to convey the knowledge base we already have under each domain and invite other organisations and individuals to bring their perspectives and ideas for solutions. Our meetings on communication, information or social participation, you can find them on this YouTube channel. So today I'm really pleased to be hosting this conversation about outdoor spaces and buildings. You can say this about any of the domains to some degree, but our public spaces truly affect every other aspect of how people experience living life in a modern city. The built environment determines people's community engagement opportunities, their health, their feelings of safety and social inclusion. I'm not saying that if we get this right, all other challenges and inequalities will be ameliorated, but making our built environment work for everyone can go a huge way to improving outcomes in multiple domains, be they healthcare access and needs, community cohesion, employment and volunteering, or access to social and physical activity. Making destinations such as our local high streets more accessible and welcoming can make a significant contribution to reviving our local economy and reducing cars on our roads. So how does the age friendliness of the built environment influence quality of life? Now, a brief note that I'm using the title Outdoor Spaces and Buildings in this presentation, as that's the wording used in the WHO framework. But to demystify that slightly, what I'm essentially talking about is public spaces. In Bristol, most of our public spaces are urban, so retail districts, areas built for people to congregate, residential streets, community centres, libraries, and local authority-run galleries and cultural spaces. We also have a large amount of green space for a city of our size and density, with 400 parks and green spaces in Bristol local authority area, so the age friendliness of those is also a huge part of what we need to consider when making our public spaces accessible across the life course. We all want to live in a city that is vibrant and socially connected, but we only truly achieve that goal if our fellow citizens are able to keep active and access the services and social spots they want when they get older. This means considering accessibility and geographic equity, removing obstacles that prevent people from using and enjoying public spaces, as well as placing well-being focused spaces equally among neighbourhoods. Now, what do age-friendly outdoor spaces and buildings look like? Here are 3 examples of many. So, clear streets. Obstacles along walking routes can pose huge barriers to older people who have an increased chance of having reduced eyesight or mobility, and our next presentation from Pippa Winship will go into this in more detail. Seating and toilets. This is one of those problems that isn't apparent to many people until it becomes a chronic problem for them. But for many people, the decision to visit a space is dictated by whether they will be able to go there without exceeding their physical limits or being caught short. And social infrastructure, so having vibrant and varied local high streets, pleasant and accessible green spaces, and safe areas to congregate. Good social infrastructure improves health, safety, and the local economy, and I'll come on to this in more detail later. So what challenges are we currently facing in Bristol? Here's a brief snapshot taken from this year's Quality of Life survey, which surveyed 4,420 households in total. So this survey should be taken with caveats in that it's a self-selected group from those randomly invited and isn't entirely proportionate to the city's demographic, but it is a relatively large sample size compared to most local data we have, and it's useful for identifying disparities and inequalities between different groups and areas of the city. So here's 3 notable statistics. 79% of Bristolians were satisfied with our parks and open spaces, but among respondents from the city's most deprived areas, this fell to just over half. The likelihood of visiting parks and open spaces at least once per week decreased with age, from 60% for all ages to 40% for over 65s. There was also a 10% disparity between white people and people from Black, Asian or minority ethnic backgrounds of all ages. And among people whose physical health prevented them from leaving home when they wanted, this was significantly skewed by age, with over 20% of over 60s facing this barrier. So on to a few specifics, starting with access to green spaces. We found from conversations we've had with older people and public domain data that proximity to green spaces in Bristol and their accessibility is not evenly spread across the city. An insight from the 2020 Quality of Life survey was that people living within 10 minutes walk of a local open space were twice as likely to be satisfied with life compared to those whose local open space was further away. So keeping this provision and proximity in mind when planning new housing and looking at the creation or regeneration of existing spaces is key. Barriers to accessing local green space can include inadequate seating, unstable or incomplete paths. Often paths don't run the entire perimeter of a space, meaning people who need a stable walking route have to go back on themselves, which can be at best unappealing and at worst unsafe. Entrance barriers inaccessible to those using mobility aids, prevalence of litter, and the presence of potential hazards such as ball games, skateboarders, or dogs off the lead. This isn't by any means a suggestion that older people were intolerant to other users of green spaces. Several we've spoken to enjoyed sharing space with people playing sport, but where design meant that people had to be careful to avoid each other, this can create a barrier for people with sensory loss or reduced mobility. Now back to seating and toilets. So as I mentioned before, this isn't always apparent as a problem to people until it affects them or someone they know. But when you do become aware of it, it becomes screamingly obvious how many public spaces aren't accessible to people because of a lack of those facilities. For a podcast episode on age-friendly outdoor space and buildings, which we recorded a couple of years ago, one of our older volunteers explained that two things. So being able to stop and have a rest partway along the route and being able to access a toilet without having to buy something can make the difference between being able to walk to the local shops or having to drive to a supermarket further away. Something that came up often when speaking to older people for Bristol's age-friendly baseline assessment was that seating and benches are often in parks and near views or beauty spots, which is great, but seating in purely practical areas such as halfway up a steep road or en route to shops would be helpful too. Sadly, most of the public toilets we had a few years ago have closed due to cuts. There is a citywide community toilet scheme, as well as local versions in Bedminster and Brislington, but COVID has disrupted much of this, so it appears there's still a need for a permanent solution that works for people experiencing this as a barrier. And removing these barriers should be a priority for everyone who uses or works in public spaces, not just because we believe in equity, but because keeping our high streets alive depends on people being able to use them easily. Now on to accessible pavements, which I'll just touch on briefly again because we're very lucky to have an in-depth academic analysis in the next presentation. I actually prepared this slide before speaking to Pippa about her findings, and our existing evidence for speaking to older people chimes very much with her findings. So the major obstacles that can make pavements inaccessible include pavement parking, overhanging branches, dog fouling, household bins and street bins where they're poorly placed, and A-boards outside shops, pubs and restaurants. Those have actually been banned by some local councils. Street design also makes a huge difference with things such as a lack of drop curbs or continuous footways, crossings with inadequate time to cross, and potholes, uneven cobbles and train tracks all posing barriers. There are some local residents groups such as Let's Walk Bedminster, which have run paper campaigns to encourage residents to be mindful of obstacles that they may be creating for others. We've suggested that a citywide campaign on this issue would help those areas with fewer resources and social capital to start from scratch. So as a positive example, here's an example of some relatively recent pedestrian-friendly infrastructure in Clapham in London, showing a continuous pedestrian crossing with no drop down from the road. Since dropping this into the slide, I've realised we have one of these on Millennium Square in Bristol between the planetarium and the Slug and Lettuce. So I'm not saying London are completely ahead of us, but this I think is a particularly striking image of how you can really give pedestrians priority and make our pedestrianised areas truly accessible. And finally, onto the evidence of how age-friendly outdoor spaces and buildings create a sense of belonging. There's consensus among social scientists that this is as important as the physical accessibility and practicality of amenities in a neighbourhood. Public spaces have the power both to improve our sense of self. Our world gets bigger when we don't just have access to a space, but we're part of it, or to create or compound isolation. So when we talk about isolation and loneliness, or more positively about having the amount and type of social contact that we want, we often think about close friendships and formal relationships, so the kinds of interactions that are dependable but that also require a certain amount of effort to maintain. What can get overlooked in this narrative is what's called weak ties, so the connections we form through using shared spaces, meeting fellow dog walkers, gym goers, bus users, shop assistants, hospitality workers, or neighbours in the same estate or shared building. These everyday interactions are fundamental to feeling connected to a place and part of our social infrastructure that is yet to be fully restored post-pandemic. In terms of age friendliness, fostering weak ties in urban planning is arguably just as important as fostering strong ones through community development and third sector projects. These kinds of exchanges also produce what's called bridging capital, so essentially connections made between diverse groups of people who would be less likely to encounter each other in private social spaces. I also raise this as there's a common stereotype that occurs when people mention older people's use of public spaces, and that's fear of crime. In fact, according to the Quality of Life Survey, older people are no more likely than others to feel unsafe walking in their local area, either during the day or at night. Over 65s were actually less likely than others to stay at home due to fear of crime. This is not to belittle people's public safety concerns, and we do need to urgently address minority groups' safety in public spaces, especially in light of recent events in Bristol and elsewhere. But I'd caution against making this assumption when it comes to considering older people's reasons for not using public spaces. Here's another inspiring example from another age-friendly place, an older people's play area in Manchester. These are also common in China and are a great example of a space that makes exercise, leisure and social connection accessible to people in later life. And finally, I just wanted to give everyone some food for thought, really, on how our use of public spaces has changed over the last 20 months. For many of us who work, the spaces in which we spend our time has changed hugely, hence me being in my spare room right now. I wanted to leave you with this quote from the Loneliness Lab, which is a global collective which produced a fascinating report this year called Using Design to Connect Us. So do look it up. It talks about what were distinct places, our homes, our work and leisure and social spaces, and how the pandemic saw them merge and is likely to shape the way we interact in them for years to come. So without wanting to use the language of crisis as opportunity, it's only right that we rethink how these three spaces can work for all of us now. Okay, on to our next presentation.